All right, well, we're ready for the next session. I'm Brian Wildenthal. I teach at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, which is just over the hill in downtown here in San Diego. And it's a great honor to be back here. I enjoy every year attending and moderating when called upon. And so we're next going to hear from Gerard Magliocca from Indianapolis, who is going to present his book on John Bingham, who is a figure who's near and dear to my heart and some of the work that I've done. Obviously, considered the primary drafter of the 14th Amendment, and Earl Maltz will be the commentator on this paper. So with no further ado.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. And thanks to Earl also for pinch hitting on short notice when Mike Curtis had to pull out, unfortunately. Well, I'm delighted to be here, although I have to say this is a bit like asking a miner to come to a jewelry convention, right? Because in this project, I'm here to present new raw material on originalism, at least on American originalism, rather than a new take on originalist theory, although, of course, there are aspects of theory that will sort of come or exude from the facts that you see in the excerpts of the book. So I thought I would take my time to explain basically what my goals are for the book and at least the most important things or some of the things that I've learned in the course of my research on Bingham that I found surprising and that you might also find surprising. So aside from the fact that I think Bingham's life presents an interesting story that deserves to be told fully, there are really two considerations that I think drove me to this project. And the first is to make the original understanding of the 14th Amendment more accessible to scholars as well as to anyone else who cares to know about it. You know, there's this discussion, and it was alluded to in the introduction, as to, well, do originalists pay more attention to the founding than to the Reconstruction Amendments, and if so, why is that? And the claim has been made sometimes that, well, the reason is because one period or another presents answers that are friendlier or materials that are friendlier to whatever point of view someone is trying to put forward, and that might account for why some people like the founding period rather than the Reconstruction period. They get better answers. That may be part of the explanation for some people, but I think the better answer really is it's simply easier in some respects to understand core aspects of the founding. Why? Because there are some clear canonical texts you can look at to get a good sense of what was going on. You have Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention. You have the Federalist Papers. And I would add, although I'm not equating it with the first two, but Pauline Maier's book that came out last year on the ratification debates surrounding the Constitution in the states, I think is an extraordinarily wonderful book that presents a lot of evidence in a comprehensive way about what people were thinking about when the Constitution was being ratified. When you ask, well, what source should we look at to understand the 14th Amendment, it's hard to come up with one. That is, one can read the Congressional Globe of the 39th Congress, right? But that's difficult. I mean, the records are scattered, plus there's not a lot of context that's being provided. One can look at some books that have been written about people who were significant at that time, say Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner, but a lot of those don't really focus on law, or at least only in a fairly indirect or imperfect way. So one thought about a book like this is to say, well, this could be at least a handy reference book for thinking about or looking to what happened during the period of Reconstruction. Now, a biography is a problematic way of doing that because, of course, it's only relating to one person's view of what was going on. So in no way do I want to claim that because Bingham thought something was so, that means it was so with respect to the original understanding. I mean, in some respects, I think he was reflecting a broad consensus, but in other respects, his views were more idiosyncratic, and that's something we might get into when we get in the question and answer session. But my thought was that hopefully this book can help address or narrow this sort of availability heuristic problem and say, okay, we can have some things that are reference points or reference books on the Reconstruction amendments. I mean, obviously Kurt Lash is doing a lot of work in this context too, and done some great stuff that I rely on in this book. And so I hope that this is a trend that this will sort of help push along. Okay, the second motivation was to sort of underscore the equivalence between the founding generation and the Reconstruction generation, which is why I chose the title that I did, American Founding Son. Basically, the leaders of Reconstruction get no respect, or not much, or not as much as they deserve. Now, you know, when Lincoln the movie ends, right, there's no turn to, and now let's see what Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner did after that, right? It's sort of, that's like the end of the story, which of course it wasn't. Now, why is this? Well, part of the problem is that the leaders of Reconstruction got bad press for probably about 100 years, and certainly during the era of Jim Crow, and they haven't really fully recovered from that. I mean, in the course of this research, in looking at, let's say, unpublished dissertations that were written prior to the 1960s, it's quite evident, sort of the effect of the Dunning School of History on people's thoughts. That in effect it was like, of course the Reconstruction leaders didn't really care about blacks. That was just their excuse that they used to, you know, achieve other goals that they were pursuing, like vengeance. So that's just something that I think still has an effect on their reputations. A second thing is that it seems to me that Reconstruction gets bad press because it is deemed a failure, right? I mean, when we look at segregation and the era of Jim Crow that followed, well, Reconstruction failed, therefore its leaders just didn't quite do the job that they should have done. And I guess I want to contest that a little bit. I could have done that a little bit more in the book than I did, in that one can also look at the founding as a failure, given that they made a bargain with slavery that led to a terrible civil war. But we tend not to look at it that way. And I'm not sure why the failings of Reconstruction are worse in that respect. One might say that every period of constitutional reform is both a failure and a success, right? And then again, there is sort of an equivalence there to the founding, not sort of a hierarchy where the founding is sort of floating above at a superior level. You know, ultimately, and I ended up putting this in the conclusion of the book, it seems that the best way of capturing the way we ought to think about Reconstruction is Franklin's statement at the founding. You know, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? A republic if you can keep it. And you might say the same thing about what we got out of Reconstruction. It's sort of, well, it's a multiracial democracy or something like that, if you can keep it, which it wasn't kept for a long period of time. So whether that has to do with the people who came up with the policies underlying it or what happened subsequently, I think is, of course, a difficult debate, but one that's probably worth having in the same way that we might have it about the founders. Now, what have I learned that's surprising? And I'll go sort of in order from general things to specific things, and I'll mention just 4, and we might talk about more in the question and answer session. The first is that John Bingham said nothing about constitutional law from 1873 when he left Congress until his death in 1900. And I can find no indication anybody really cared much about what he thought about these issues. That is, I see no evidence in all the correspondence that survives, you know, with the qualification that, of course, many things didn't survive, that anyone even asked for his opinion. And when he died, his obituaries often didn't even mention the fact that he wrote the 14th Amendment or say anything about it. And if you go to Cadiz, Ohio, which is where he lived much of his life and where he's buried, you'll see there's a statue to him in front of the county courthouse, which has an epitaph which does not mention that he wrote the 14th Amendment, though it does mention that he was for high tariffs. That's a protection of industry. That's what we're supposed to remember him for. Now, one can come up with many explanations for this as to whether that says something about what people would have thought about originalism at the time, or whether it's simply when things are within lived experience, nobody thinks that anybody has a particularly privileged view of what originalism is. It's just everybody who was involved, right? Okay. So that's one point that I found disappointing but also interesting about this research. Second, John Bingham was the real leader of the House Republicans during Reconstruction, not Thaddeus Stevens. So one object or sort of result of this work is that it's sort of like the casting down of Thaddeus Stevens, I want to call it. Because if you look closely at the situation, Stevens usually lost on the major issues of the day, and Bingham prevailed. It's just that Stevens had a more outsized personality, so we tend to remember him more. And so I think the record should be adjusted to reflect the facts of Bingham's role in the Reconstruction process. Third, there's an interesting relationship between Bingham's role as a prosecutor in the trial of the conspirators to murder Lincoln and the original understanding of the 14th Amendment. That is, Lincoln assassination people know that he was one of the prosecutors, but they don't know anything about constitutional law, and constitutional law scholars tend not to know that Bingham was one of the prosecutors in the trial, because he made a number of interesting constitutional arguments there about the role of due process in wartime that also carried over to some of what he said in Congress. And putting those two things together gets us some new insights. And since I think I'm out of time, I'll stop with 3 things, and then we can do the 4th thing later in a Q&A. Thanks.